Resume recording.
Well, I have to
Right.
scroll up. There we go. Got it. There we go.
Hi, Jordan. It's been a
Um,
while. It's been a while, a few months since we've done our recording. So I'm looking forward to some kind of fresh insights coming in our lives. Um, what
yeah.
are you sensing? What are you sensing? And I'll maybe return the thoughts.
Well, I would say the first thing I was noticing is that it does. I feel very fresh. Like very little of. That's not quite right, but very little of what I've had, or even what's happened between us, or things that I've been working on for the past few years, is up front and center. Everything's very flat. It's a bit of that. What's that called in cognitive science? From attention to diffusion. I'm in a very diffuse mode right now. And so I'm largely just allowing what maybe hasn't been in the foreground, but maybe should be, to see if there's anything like that that needs to pop through.
Yeah, I mean, I share this. I also think, I mean, to use a word like I sense a quickening, and certainly what I've experienced is so I was in ALPAC, European ALPAC Forum or Forum ALPAC, and it was interesting that I got invited onto a panel with a central banker, with BlackRock, with Erste Bank, and various others, and we were talking about capital markets, and I was talking about actually how ESG and impact is nowhere close to understanding the amount of catastrophic damage our existing capital markets are doing. They are effectively the resource that's self-terminating us. And it was interesting that you could sit in a panel to have that conversation and to be, frankly, to even the construction of that space feels to me unique at a kind of stepping moment where actually you can have that debate and you can start to talk about the quantum of shift that we're facing in a way that isn't, it's not an argument, it's not a sort of, it's just a statement of condition, and a statement of condition which recognizes um, how fundamentally and systemically, we're not pricing risk or recognizing the scale of the transition and the scale of a worldview transition that we're in the middle of. So lots of people talk about, this being, we're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And I think that would be factually incorrect. I think we're moving from a unipolar world to an entangled world. A unipolar world effectively still has, and a multipolar world still has core inner periphery and outer periphery in a relationship of asymmetric power. I think what we're seeing is an entanglement come into full effect where that asymmetry no longer is viable because the feedback effects, whether it's CO2, whether it's social informational feedbacks or biofeedbacks or other forms of environmental feedbacks and all sorts of other things, are now driving a conscious entanglement that is challenging the doctrine that we built the worldview on, the object perspective classification theory, which were all the power of kings. Kings constructed perspective in order to create power and separation that permitted violence. And that whole view is unraveling as our entanglements become manifest. And for me, what I'm sensing is is a shift, is a kind of shift in the speed and the scale of cognition that's happening at the system level. That this sort of reality. And the other thing that I'm finding is languages are shifting. I mean, so one of the things I've been very critical of is how let's say the left has never understood the word freedom and has never talked about the word freedom. And what I find problematic is that really the left, certainly in the European context, often talks about solidarity. But what it doesn't understand is actually the scale of entrapment people feel in their lives, an
Mm-hmm.
entrapment and a diminishment of being human. So the freedom is not the freedom to escape the system, which is, I think, a capitalist theory of freedom. A kind of an illusory goal that you can escape the powers of capital, but a freedom to be human, which I think is a completely different thesis of freedom. And I think we have we're captured by the system as bad robots as opposed to the freedom to be human. So I think there's new language and taxonomy which has visceral spell-like powers. And I think the other frame that I'm finding very powerful is the theory of talking about the need for a great peace, recognizing we're living in a great war. And the war is about a war between ourselves, the war on ourselves, our bodily selves, our war onto our ecological systems, and our war to our future selves. And recognizing that unless we can construct a great peace, we are in self-termination. So I think there's language which isn't about we need to go to war against climate change, but the language of discovering a new peace is the objective. So I think there's new politics, there's new comprehension, there's new conversations that are possible in the system that have historically not been possible. And the quickening is at speed. And I find that interesting that actually this conversation is no longer marginal amongst, our community, but is now stepping into stages where these things are becoming material. Because, and I think the final point I'd make is that they're becoming material because our capital system relies on the ability of predictability and insurance. So if our world becomes less predictable, it becomes less insurable and thereby less capital allocatable. So we're seeing an unwinding of our predictable systems and thereby reducing our capital allocation powers. And that, I think, is changing centralized capital and its capacity to deal with the transition at a structural level. So I think we're in a really interesting moment. And in the last 3 months, I think that's one of the big things I'd say is that all those conversations are quickening at a rapid rate. And I could carry on, but maybe I'll sort of open up.
Yeah, well, I mean, let the insight settle for a bit, but something that I was noticing is if I go down actually 2 generations, so both millennials and Zoomers, this conversation is almost like a pyramid. There's tens of thousands of people who are younger, who are fully armed to have these conversations. Right? They have brought themselves up the curve, oftentimes by their own bootstraps, and are engaging in these conversations amongst themselves in a very rich way. So, to the degree to which, how do I say, like choice making finds a way to produce capillaries into those groups and resources, there's a reservoir of capacity that is not living in the institutionally legitimated infrastructure necessarily, right? It's not coming through credentialed institutions, but the capacity to actually be able to participate in this level of conversation is actually available to a meaningful amount. Okay, what was the insight? Oh, the insight. So what I was seeing was a sheet of ice, and then an increase in the
Jordan, I may have lost audio with you. I may have lost audio.
era.
Yeah, that's it. Better. Sorry, I lost audio.
But then what I noticed was that, how do I say this right? It sort of has always been the case that we're going to have to design fluid polymorphic institutions, just to use the term, right? The word institution is going to have to change from something that has that's what happened. But when my wife drove away, my phone went to the car. But now she's going to need to turn off Bluetooth real quick so it doesn't happen again. So it was always going to be the case that we had to design, we'll have to change the nature, almost like the material of institutions, from things that resemble Tinker Toys to something that's more like silly putty, right? It's something that has an intrinsic fluidity. And this notion of polymorphic is also quite critical, just to stay with the children's toys metaphors, where, do you remember that stuff that you had as a kid that was a non-Newtonian liquid, where if you pushed slowly, it was liquid. If you pushed hard, it was solid?
Yeah.
Like that. You could imagine silly putty that can become transparent if necessary, can become very rigid if necessary, but ultimately can actually morph both its characteristics, its sort of physical characteristics on a high dimensional basis. And that's the metaphor of the material of these new institutional structures. And I mean, what I was doing is I was rotating through all the different characteristics. You're saying like entangled, vertical entanglement, right? Multiple different layers of scale. Rhizomatic entanglement, causal structures that transport across boundaries that we think are boundaries, but in fact are not boundaries. And all these elements produce a rate of change and a rate of novelty or a rate of unexpectedness, so that the characteristics of insurability, like this notion of risk, we can't even really do risk management anymore. Right? This is the idea. There's not that sort of the risk premium becomes too high, but rather the risk itself is no longer the valid epistemological category. We're actually now in the category of uncertainty, which requires a different modality. We know how to deal with this modality, but it's not a modality that since the Enlightenment that we've actually been dealing with in an institutionally formal way. So here we are, I guess.
I think that's a really critical point. As the world becomes critically unpredictable, thereby we live in a landscape of uncertainty, and our ability to construct in a landscape of uncertainty is different to a landscape of some theory of predictable illusions. Let's say that even our predictability was an illusion materially. It was just a convenient illusion, sort of a convenient framework in which to operate. And I think that's been dismantled. But what I find fascinating is the speed of it. And also what I find fascinating is that, if we look at this from a fractal sense, if we say, the great moment that we're living in is a moment of re-agentifying the world. So democracy is not about just the kind of representational power, but I would say the re-agentification of the world, where actually the agent capacity of the world is emancipated. And I would argue that, one of the things that's happened is that our democratic systems have agentified the world sufficiently that our industrial predictive democracies can no longer govern. So we've actually broken our own system in our metamorphosis. And it's not a failure, it's a transcendence. So I think we often fail. You had to build industrial democracy this way to get to the point where the agentification of the world was so large that industrial predictive systems could no longer work. And now we need a metamorphosis of our theory of governance from predictive control to a new theory of learning. And so what I would say is learning-driven coherence as opposed to control-driven coherence. And sort of how do you support learning-driven coherence in a system? And what I think is fascinating is that when you move down that route, it challenges all sorts of things. So, is the nation state a red line boundary, or is a nation state an entanglement of flows? Are we talking about agency and interbeing? And actually the relation, there's a lots of arguments which say your intelligence is a function of your relationships in the world. It's a relational function as opposed to an intrinsic function. And if you look at this being a relational knot, I don't think it's just that. I think it's a knot of relationships which have a combinatory effect, both by being embodied in other things. You start to talk about a new type of beingness, which is actually both interbeing and also knotted to construct an agent in that interbeing. And those two things have to coexist, and we don't have language for it. It's sort of it's an interbecoming in a way. Let's use those two words. It's not interbeing, and it's interbecoming, because the agentification is really critical, not static. And so, and then if you expand that thesis to not just humans, but non-human machine systems, we talk about this great age of interbeingness as an expansion of the world. And that is an extraordinary, and as soon as we do that, we move at a fractal level. So I would say that agent interbeing is at the nation state level, at the bioregional level, at the individual level. So it's a fractal worldview, which then creates an entanglement, which means that our theory of operating with each other becomes fundamentally different. And that, I think, is a metamorphosis that we're right now in the middle of. And it's perceivable. That's the other thing. That there was a kind of moment when this was not perceivable. I think we built the bureaucratic frameworks and the kind of sort of what I would call what I call computational bureaucracy, to be able to construct those capabilities, the agentification of the world. And that, I think, is an extraordinary paradigm leap moment for us as a civilization at a planetary scale.
Yeah, so what was coming to mind was that I think I very much shake my head yes in this notion of it wasn't a failure, and no more so than it's a failure when a grandparent passes on their inheritance of their world to their grandchild, right? That's how it works. You successfully create a change in the world such that the world that you came from is no longer the world that is, and then you gift it down to the ones that are rising up in that world. And the fact that this happens at a level of scale much larger than the individual human isn't surprising. So here we are, right? We're very much in that mode. And I guess what you're saying is you're perceiving it now at a level of how would I say? Well, I guess a level of power, a level of Overton, the Overton window. It's within the Overton window. Um, we're no longer sort of off stage shouting things onto the stage, but now you're sitting at the table at the stage having conversations, and people around you are nodding their heads and maybe even understanding.
And I would say it's not just me, it's yourself, it's Daniel, it's Nate, there's a whole plethora of people that are sitting on stage and I think that's great. And I think that's exactly the moment that we're in and I think what's really interesting is that I think what people like yourself and Daniel and others are describing the world with greater coherence than the old world is able to describe the world.
Right.
And so the incoherence in the language is now visible to the point of not being, it can be emotionally felt, let alone even cognitively felt. So I think that means that, somebody beautifully said, it was very elegant when it said, Indy, I did not understand every word that you said, but you put words to what I was feeling. And what I loved about that sentence was the idea that I was not giving him ideas. I was giving him clothes for the ideas that he already had.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And that,
right?
and by the way, learning, this is how learning at its optimum works, right? The individual has experiences. Those experiences play out in a highly, perfectly and infinitely entangled way in complex reality with their complex interior. It becomes more and more clear. And then a proper teacher gives a word that, and then they know how can hold that. But you don't give them the word first. They have to go through the experience first so that they're really present to the richness of it. Oh my goodness, that's exactly it. And of course,
And
it's
I
a
think,
reminder the
yeah.
necessity of actually learning. Like we really do have to take it not just as a conceptual framework, but as the embodied practice of this is how we deal with this sort of world. How you deal with the complex, entangled world is you learn how, right? You participate with.
And this is the other part of it, that I think one of the big challenges that we face is that our investment is into material technologies, carbon capture, XYZ. But what we aren't doing is the investment in the reimagination of being human and the re-emancipation of being human. And without it, I'm not sure we can make this transcendence, because there's no way. And and what people don't quite get is that to reimagine ourselves as interbecomings and in that sense is a developmental arc. But it also, once you do that, you change your relationship with technology. You change your relationship with everything. Because one of the things that I think I've just been reflecting on over the last few months is that, we have such a dystopian relationship with technology. And I think our dystopian relationship is a function of the othering of technology. So since the 1970s, I think when we saw the mass individualization of our economies and societies, we also individuated and distanced ourselves from technology. And the technology became an other. And in a Japanese context, the technology is not an other. And as soon as you other it, it becomes a landscape of fear, and it becomes a landscape of capital and control. It becomes a landscape of violence between each other. Whereas actually, if you see it through an entanglement, it is not separate to us being human. And I think part of the challenge that we face is we've allowed technology to become separated from our thesis of human. And I would argue the dystopian science fiction films that sort of fill our world from the 70s onwards are actually a representation of this othering of technology. And actually, we have to re-entangle ourselves not only with our ecological systems, but our machine systems. and talk about positive relationships, where actually technology is not a means of extraction and solutioneering, but is actually a much more powerful entangled relationship. And I think so the human development arc also reframes, I think, our symbiotic relationship with technology and thereby our development arc on our technological landscape, which I think is currently misguided. I think our technological arc is part of an industrial control theory model, which we haven't yet transcended.
Right, right. So this is at a meta level, it would be uh, like a nice approach would actually be to go through and begin to enumerate the legacy models, and then begin to build a map of where our choices being guided by models that are themselves obsolete. And in fact, you can even put it on a color gradient, out of touch, obsolete, actively destructive of being so obsolete, that kind of a sort of a distance. And then we can of course say, okay, where do we have models that are already relatively well understood that we can begin to deploy, or where is there blank space? Like where's the dark matter that we actually can perceive the need, but we actually don't even have a real way of, still at the feeling level. We actually can't put words to it yet. I mean, that's a program. And it'd be helpful if we could do it at that level of formality, because then you could actually, explain to somebody, well, the reason why this particular resource allocation choice that you're making isn't producing the result that you want is actually because you're using an industrial control model, which is 70 years out of date. If we take a look at it in this new approach, you can see that it actually opens up a completely different way of thinking about what it is you're doing, for example.
Exactly, and I think this is why I think the human development pathways, and we know in history, right, the Industrial Revolution was precursored by so investment in the educational reforms that UK did before the
Yep.
Industrial Revolution. Every transition is being precursored by human development, and I think what we haven't yet understood is we're relying on the technological revolution without actually investing in our human development revolution, and that would be the extraordinary agenda of any significant global leader, would be to actually pivot the whole story and saying we're going to invest in the human development landscapes, recognizing that would fundamentally transform our technological options, because the option landscape of technology is now limited by a legacy landscape. And I think that is going to be the unique capacity of reimagining a technological landscape. Because I think one of the things that's become very clear is that we're living in a two-lock paradigm of what I would say capital control technologies, capital centric technologies, or what I would call state centric technologies. And both have a tendency to be extractive in different formats. Both are problematic in terms of their extractive relationships, because that's what capital structures. And so there's a really interesting question about, is there a genuine third path of technology which is symbiotic and agentified in itself, which becomes an agent-based technology, which has a complete different characteristic and behavior to those two surveillance technologies? Because things only become surveillance if they are passed through to a meta body. So, I use the metaphor of we're working on a surveillance camera and transforming it to a care camera. And surveillance is only surveillance if somebody can see through it to create a meta arc. If the camera is owned by a trust and nobody can see through it, but it has a visual learning framework and will automatically trigger the police, ambulance, and other support if something is required, and stores the information. But if you want to access it, you have to access it with a digital warrant, which is stored on that, which means that that camera no longer becomes a tool of surveillance, but genuinely a relationship of care. So
Oh
I
wow.
think so re-governing and rewrapping the governance of and this is that every camera becomes a micro trust. And then every camera shares its recordings with each other in a swarm-like fashion as a service function. Then every camera, as it provides a relationship of care, is paid micro cents to be able to pay for it. And every time a digital warrant is issued, it pays a computational fee for the release of that. So you create these computational economies, which are fundamentally anti-surveillance because of the nature of the governance architecture you built them. So they become a class of new forms of technologies that strip out either state or capital-centric systems to create a new form of technology. And I think that's what these paradigm leaps open up, is a new class of agentified technology, which is fundamentally different in characteristics and behavior.
Yeah, that's a very nice example, because it has a solidity to it of the ship. Because as you say, if I have a one-way mirror, that creates an intrinsic asymmetry, which then produces um, a topology, right? I'm on one side, you're on the other side. I have the ability to see you, you don't have the ability to see me. We now have a very clean power dynamic. If I have something where it's, well, if I have a two-way mirror, then we have a very different power dynamic. And of course, we can sort of play with all kinds of variations on the theme. So by modifying the topology of the, what would we call it? What's it called? The technosphere? Yeah.
Mhm.
Consciously, like we're actually quite thoughtfully now actually able to operate at a level of design to be sensitive to what are the consequences of our design choices. You know, we're living in a post-design era. It's actually important to realize that. And we had an engineering phase, and then we had the emergence of a design phase. We're living past the design phase. We're actually able to be consciously thinking about the consequences of our design choices on the landscape that our power is actually going to be implementing itself on. But I want to loop it back to that notion of the human element because one, I sort of agree at the level of problem, meaning we're in a bind, and the bind is a bind where we're endeavoring to resolve the problem using the technocratic approach, and we're sort of hitting that lever faster and faster and harder, and noticing diminishing returns and increasing externalities. And of course, the answer there is to say, well, the problem is actually not at the level of not deploying enough resources in the level of the technocratic control modality. The problem is we have to actually shift ever so slightly over here into the human side, and there's a huge landscape of possibility just waiting to pop through. And if we point the right resources there, what we'll see is there's degrees of freedom that we didn't even know existed in this new landscape. So we don't have to force it's the dimensionality issue, right? It turns out there's a Z dimension, guys. We don't have to keep trying to push through at this level. We can go up. Maybe go up. It's just a very simple way of putting it. We need to build. Humans have the ability to go from crawling on the earth to standing vertically, and that makes a big difference in what kinds of things that we can do.
Absolutely. And I think it's at the root of this transition. And I think this is where, I think this is where building the freedom to care, the freedom to be human, building the infrastructure to unleash and emancipate people as part of this language, but also there's that human developmental journey to be able to do that. And I think this is I suppose the analogs in history of this are there, right? The Industrial Revolution, 1813, Denmark invested in Volk schools to build self-authoring capacity of 10% of its population in the 19th century. We've seen these moments where nation states have done these extraordinary human development capacities and built the kind of capacities. And these weren't centralized. These were all co-ops all over Denmark and Sweden and the Nordics, and they grew rapidly as these new capabilities of building self-authoring capabilities. And Thomas Bjorkman writes very eloquently about this in Nordic Secret. Mm-hmm. So we have in history seen these moments. And I think, the question for us is, and this is the other part, the question for us is that we need to be able to do this at a planetary scale. So this is the other part of the dimension that for uniquely, I think, where we sit is that we live already in a planetary civilization. Every dimension of us is already planetary. And yet what we haven't built, and I think one of the big challenges is that we face a kind of a fork, which is a fork between mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving. And there is no middle path. And I think there's a kind of a false thesis that I think some of our friends, intellectual friends and sort of people like Peter Thiel, I think have been putting up, which is an argument of competitive development of humanity as a pathway. And the challenge, I think, is that for the first time, and I think Daniel makes this argument very eloquently, the kind of decentralized capacity of whether it's biowarfare or nuclear systems or any of those capabilities, information warfares and other things that we have at our disposal, means that actually any form of extreme violence where we lose 7 billion people in the planet will almost certainly put us in a tailspin of such systemic trauma that most of human civilization will not survive. So we have to do something extraordinarily different to make this transition. And that is going to require a degree of greatness, and I'm going to use that word, because it's a sort of it's a self-interest, but it's a massively super enlightened self-interest behavior. And someone's going to play that extraordinary card to the point that it becomes the only viable path. I don't think we have a choice. That's the other thing. I think the war games and stuff, there's no choice. But I think we maintain the illusion of there being a choice. And that's an extraordinary moment, because I would argue that's our Fermi paradox, I would argue. That transcendence is our Fermi paradox. And if we make that, we're in a whole new economy.
Yes, that transcendence is our Fermi paradox. I think you and I may even have said this a while back.
Yeah.
Like offline. So yes, I completely agree with that as well. And I, in the back of my mind, have the hypothesis that may be the Fermi paradox in general. I think that's what we're dealing with is not an unusual phenomenon. It feels the sort of thing, if you were to step back, be like, yeah, once you do the technology thing at all, way the heck back then, maybe even once you have nervous systems. I don't know where this thing starts. It may start all the way back, but this trajectory is more or less going to play out this way. And here you are. What was it? Greatness. So what I noticed was actually the necessity of, not the necessity, but the availability of a tremendous humility in this notion of greatness, because I know that I've read it somewhere, but the notion is that the greatness is actually in the moment, not in the man. Right? The man is merely adequate to the moment that he finds himself in. And in some senses, it's even stochastic, as you said. If we don't make it through, we didn't make it through. So there's nobody to judge us for our lack of greatness. If we did make it through, then greatness was the name that you put to having made it through something at this moment. Now we can say, though, that if to be called to greatness produces the change that is necessary in the individuals and the leaders that are looking around with wide eyes, wondering what to do, and say, yeah, this is a much more spiritual kind of war than the war of your forefathers, right? You can't look back to the notion of charging the machine guns. Like, that's a form of courage that was very powerful and very important, but too coarse-grained for where we are now. This is a different kind of thing. It's a level of courage that is as great in intensity, but more subtle and more fine-grained, more nuanced, right? Because that's just the nature of the environment that we're in. This is that notion of entanglement and fractal like levels up and down. So you have to become one who's equal to the moment in all ways, in the nature of the moment itself, right? You have to respond to what you're being called to respond to. But if you do, right, if we do choose to step into that with complete commitment, right? There's no hedging bets, right? This is an all-in sort of thing.
But there's no choice. There's no choice, right? So this is the other thing. It's an illusion, right? To think, I mean, I quite like, I think I've said it before, I quite like Jurassic Park. Life wants to live. And if life wants to live, we don't really have a choice. This is a journey we're on, and we're gonna have to deal with it. And I think I love your sort of framing of greatness. Yes, I think it's an invitation. And I think it's an invitation to an extraordinary moment. And I think, an extraordinary invitation. I genuinely think it's an extraordinary invitation and I think you can taste it now. I think people can taste it. That's the other thing. I think we can give words to it, but I think people can feel it in their bones. And I think this is what I mean. Like, I think people can feel the war in their bones. And when you viscerally say, let's discover, the greatness will be the greatness to discover a great peace. That is going to be the greatness, the discovery of a great peace. And that is a powerful invitation, a powerful piece of oratory that I think would herald, some of the great leaders in the 60s in terms of the oratory power of what it will viscerally drive.
So what I notice is that I've experienced a real feeling of fellowship. What I was thinking about was my mind was struggling with the fact that, how do I say it right? It's not evenly distributed. That's the way of putting it. So this conversation is beginning to happen, but it's not evenly distributed. Like, if you were to go into the sort of senior vice president's suite at BlackRock, it's not 80% of the people who are there. But what I've noticed is that the people who are having this conversation are popping up all over the place. And I've noticed a tremendous feeling of fellowship, like a feeling of love, actually, a feeling of real care, a feeling of encouragement, of like, wow, I admire you. I admire what you're doing. I feel enthusiastic about frankly just your sheer existence, but also the things you're engaging in, and the feeling of, oh, there's a kinship happening here. There's something going on where once you pop through, once you step into this moment, once you step into this invitation, you're on a team, right? And it's funny,
Yeah.
it's a intrinsic team, because we can look around and say, oh, there is no other choice. Clearly, this is the right way to do this sort of thing. It's the right way to play, where our boundaries are very clean. If you pay close attention to the nature of reality, you move slowly enough that you don't delude yourself into what's happening. You can look around and say, oh, okay, the rules of this new game are actually rather clear. Um, and then what I notice is that when I encounter people who, for whatever reason, aren't getting there, I just have a feeling of sadness. You know, when you find somebody who really is in a position where if they could make it through that portal, that, it's like, wow, you really could shift things so well from where you are right now if you could just find your way through that portal, and they don't. And I'm like, that's that human development. Like,
It's,
how do we help people move their way through?
it's true. And I think there's two dimensions of this, I would say. That one is that I think the argument now is hyper robust and clean. So I think
Mm,
what I find is when you lay the argument out, it's very difficult for people to deny it because I think it's a cloud structure, quite quite a lot of, as you were saying, like those fluids. It's got robustness and liquidity to it. It can absorb. It's got a very high quality to it. I think what I find interesting is that people are actually mostly trapped by legacies,
yeah.
mostly trapped by you know language. How they say, you own your possessions and your possessions own you.
Mm,
I think that is the characteristic. I think people are trapped by the world that they've bought, and trapped by the idea of the world that they've bought. And I think that's the entrapment that people are also feeling. So I think you have to root the argument in the entrapment that they feel to help liberate them. But I think I think people are feeling it. But I hear you. I think it's available. I think these, I hate using these sort of words, but I think there's spell-like quality to words. Certain words sort of resonate deep in the soul of people's being. And I think they have spell-like qualities to them. And I think
yeah.
stuff like I think we have to rebind freedom, the freedom to be human, and the right to be human in its fullest sense, and actually to live as interbeing, to recognize our becoming in our interbeing. These are, and the kind of great piece, like there is things emerging, and this is for me a fractal model. So once you recognize it, it fractally sort of replicates all the way through, and it challenges all theories of property, challenges all theories of actually how we orchestrate in the world, our theories of relationships in the world in really radical formats. So yeah, I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, I was a long time ago, gosh, maybe 15 years ago. I had a vision of, I guess, the language of evolutionary theory of hill climbing and valley crossing, and the just the internal logic. This is I'm responding to the attachment to what you've bought. The internal logic of having become one who is the peak predator of some particular hill, in this case, late stage capitalism. Right. So, you've journeyed up that hill. You've made a lot of sacrifices, by the way, in terms of your freedom to be human. And you may painfully feel those sacrifices. Part of what you're going to what you're going to be the gifted is to be returned that freedom to be human, which is be a beautiful gift. But you've made those sacrifices. You've done the things, and you've won. You've outcompeted on this hill. You're an apex predator in the world of late stage capitalism, and so to leave that position has a certain sense of vulnerability, right? The armor and the weapons and the skills and the ways of seeing and choosing, of course, the resources that you command, you are very powerful in a particular kind of place. But the problem is this: you're noticing every day that the hill you are king of is going away. And now here's the real question: is the one who is the most canny, right, the one who is the most intent, the king of that hill, would have the capacity to notice that before anyone else and say, whoa, this game is actually now done. Maybe I was well positioned in the old game, but the old game is actually over. It's noticeably depleting. you can look around and say, wow, that the to have won that used to be a very powerful thing. Now it's actually not so powerful a thing. It's actually a little bit depressing, kind of, to be a high status player in that old game. And the invitation actually, therefore, is if you once you perceive that, to be moving, use that same energy, that same potency that was driving you up that one hill to move over to this new one. But the new one now you're saying it's now legible. There's actually a robustness to it. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of techniques and technologies and theories that we can begin to throw out there. And so I had that vision about 15 years ago. And what I hear you saying is that now we're reaching the point where the even players who are playing what I would have called game A, right, cannot help but begin to notice, if they simply pay attention to even their own instincts, that a new game is afoot.
Yeah, and I would perhaps go even further to say the meteorite has already hit and the dinosaurs don't know it yet. And the most canny have seen it hit. So, and I think I think it's that, I think it's an extinction level event for game A. That's already written in now. And
we've got a little kiosk saying how to become a mammal in 3 easy steps.
Precisely. And I think that's the metamorphosis that's required. That's genuinely the metamorphosis, because we are moving from one sort of economy and biological orchestration model to a different biological techno orchestration model. And I think that is a transcendence moment. And you're right, like, it's orders of more magnitude, more effective, more powerful, more smarter, emotionally richer, more human. It's genuinely a factor-fold more sort of magnitudes, orders of magnitudes more powerful in every sense. And that, I think, is, the game B is no longer a competition to game A. Game B transcends game A by factors. And I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, by its very, very nature. Yeah, I noticed I was looking for myself, that feeling of the quickening, and the place where it lands right now most powerfully is noticing a feeling of a proximity to an enthusiasm in place, like in the place where I am. I can imagine, if you imagine, sort of wind the clock back to being, I don't know, in like Detroit at the beginning of the automotive revolution, and just that feeling of possibility and potential of, hey, something's happening. People are doing things. There's incredible things are being created. Or fill in the blank. All those moments, and it's if you notice, like, it's always darkest before dawn. That feeling of the old techniques have so obviously lost their capacity. Oh, but the new techniques, oh my goodness, and so many people, if they just start moving over that order of magnitude, if you move just a trickle of people into these new forms, you start seeing those multiplier effects, and of course you get a second order, because now more people move into the new forms, and then we actually really get to see how rapidly that transformation can happen, and then life becomes fighting again.
Absolutely. And also, life wants to live. There is no other pathway, right? This is the other thing. I think the other thing that I wanted to sort of is the language of choice versus the language of duty. And do we have a duty to life and a duty to be human? And what does that really mean? And I think what I find interesting is the construction of illusions of choice that are actually mere forms of entrapments. Whereas actually what happens when we see this in a different lens, in the kind of World War II, it wasn't a choice really, it was a duty. And I find it interesting, we default to theories of choice because we've become so indoctrinated by quasi-market theory as a means of orchestration.
Yeah, I want to put the point on that, like put some more emphasis there. So that last point was exactly right. We've moved everyone into the position of having a role of being a consumer of a selection matrix. And so theory of choice, like your role to play is to select an option from a selection matrix that's being offered by effectively a marketplace of any sort. And this is other domain, or this domain of duty, this domain of responsibility, or this domain, by the way, also of meaning, FYI. And so to be able to actually take that duty and to hold that duty is again choiceless. It is in fact, why are you doing that? Well, it's my responsibility. I don't understand the question. The question is not even a valid question anymore. And the point is that because we've spent so much time all the way over here, we've lost track of the fact that there's a whole world over here. And many of the things that we wonder, we just sort of like stumble about wondering, or the poor folks who are just absolutely being torn apart by living in a world without meaning, without duty. The restoration of that is a how do you call it, a highly asymmetric opportunity. Like it's at a low ebb, and so to bring it back up is it's available.
Absolutely. And it kind of reminds me as you were speaking, and thank you for sort of giving it color and richness and the precision that you did. Was, do you remember, I'm going to bring this down a few notches, but do you remember the Denzel Washington dialogue with his son, where his son says, there's a very interesting dialogue where and his son says, he says, why do I have you here? He said, why do I give you food and water? He says, because you choose to. He said, I don't choose to. It's my responsibility. It's not my, he reframes the relationship outside the market choice framework and talks
Mm-hmm.
about it in a different way. And I think we've entrapped ourselves to seeing everything through this, paradigm of consumer choice as a means of orchestration. And some things aren't, exactly as you say. And some of these things are outside that paradigm. Not everything, but some things are. And I think we've lost our thesis.
Yeah, and I can imagine. I'm just calculating in the back of my mind. I can imagine that many of the people who are most lost are those for whom duty and responsibility are most central. Um, oh, for sure. There's no question about it. The more I think about it, that typology. There's a typology. There's a whole category of the human family that is actually adrift. They don't actually have their proper responsibilities, and they don't live in a world where the notion of doing your duty is sort of obvious and core. Um, and that's not this world, but that is the world of the future. This world of any viable future for sure.
Absolutely. And I think in an entanglement, in an entangled world, our relationships cannot be on extractive optimization because we don't know the damage that we do. So
Right.
our relationships have to be relationships of care in relationship, because that is only how you deal with entanglements. And that is a completely different modus operandi, a behavioral model, as opposed to a consumer extraction model. So I think this recoding of ourselves and the emancipation of being human and humane in its fullest sense, I think is really critical part of that. And I think this duty landscape, and maybe even words that transcend duty, to be in a duty of care, it might be the kind of pathways that we have to talk about.
Well, it's funny because that you just happened to use the language of fiduciary responsibility, and as you
Yeah,
know, as we're moving into the AI universe, the recognition of hey, if we simply apply a lot of these basic duties, if we simply redeploy them, they cover a lot of the concern space, and maybe all of it, but certainly a lot of it.
yeah,
And maybe to wrap a little piece there, the renaissance of parenting, the the notion of duty of care is at its most relevant and it's most clear with regard to parenting. And what I mean is this: what came to my mind was someone may misunderstand the notion of care as kind of like this saccharine irresponsibility of maxing somebody else's serotonin and dopamine receptors for a short period of time. But that, of course, that has nothing to do with care. That's the opposite of care. That's just the polar opposite. To care, it has to do with to be in real deep relationship, to understand deeply, which may, in fact, by the way, be this is your suffering. Like you need to suffer this suffering right now to actually grow in the way that you need to grow. Right? That's care. And by the way, this is not your suffering. Okay, this needs to be moved away from you so that you can have the space to grow that you need to grow. Right. That level of subtlety and nuance and carefulness, right? To be full of care, to be careful. These are all techniques and technologies and notions that we have, but boy, we need to bring them back into the toolbox.
absolutely. And also to be in care is not to be it can't be an asymmetric thing. It isn't to be a relationship of care. It's a
Mm-hmm.
symmetrical thing. And this is a behavior of symmetry, not a behavior of patronage or behavior of a sort of it's not a behavior of dominance or sort of it's to be in a relationship of care, and it has to be mutual and symmetrical. And that is a different way of being and a different way of comprehending. But yeah, I totally agree with this nuance that we mustn't fall back into an industrial idea of care, a top-down idea of care. This has
That's
to
right.
be symmetrical.
Yeah, and I noticed that the politically, it's interesting because at that location, the sort of the tired arguing points of the political environment of the 60s, 70s, and 80s actually reached their nadir. You can say, yes, the welfare state was an improper relationship to the notion of care. The intent of we should care for each other is quite right. And the notion of we are operating in a 1970s industrial model. The only way to think about how to provision care is to provide a flux and a flow of sort of indifferent resources. But the critique of that is valid. It's correct. Oh, but now you're breaking all kinds of other things and creating havoc in different directions. Well, the answer is okay. Well, let's care better now. Let's actually learn how to truly, actually, properly care, all the way down to the nuance, which is that renaissance of parenting.
So let me bring a sort of fly in this ointment just for fun. How does a war machine deal with this reality? So we will not transcend the war machine very quickly. And so part of the challenge is once we construct a human war machine, we also create the trauma and the other landscapes associated with that war machine. So in a way, the automation of the war machine is a critical pathway in this transcendence, because unless we automate the war machine, it would be very difficult for actually us to create the human development frameworks that are going to allow for societal development. So there's almost this symbiotic relationship where the war machine has to be automated for it to then be transcended in a different way. And I was just thinking, because I think one of the things I sometimes find, in a lot of the progressive conversations is we never talk about the war machine. We never talk about the theory of threat, which does exist, and the theory of competition. We won't get to the great peace instantly. We will work our way through the great peace. And in order to do that, we're going to have to construct a pathway of evolution of our war machine into a different pathway. And I just wonder where your thoughts were with regards to the kind of war machine itself and the journey that it has to take.
Well, what I was noticing was I was flipping it around in the direction of the inevitability of that. All the way back to my boy Manuel de Landa, who bizarrely has maintained his position as most least known philosopher.
Brilliant.
Yeah, the war in the age of intelligent machines, right? He called it.
Was fantastic. It was brilliant. I mean, I think Manuel de Landa has called the stage better than anyone in many formats.
I completely agree. I find it shocking that I was just lucky enough to have had. I can't even recall how I happened to find it, but I think I found it on the internet as a text. I was reading it just as something that he had been putting out there so long ago. Golly, like 97, something like that. Oh my goodness.
Absolutely.
And so if you understand the evolution of the war machine in its interior and the direction of its natural arc of where it has to go, then there's a terminal point. So what I hear you saying, you're flying the ointment, is something like, well, let's step outside of that, and with the design mentality, recognize that same fork in the road that we were talking about earlier arrives here as well. And if we're able to thoughtfully design that, knowing where it's going to go, right? Knowing that automation of it, and it's by the way, and it's how do you say? Let's just be AI and arbitrarily large. Are you familiar with the Chinese notion of systems warfare? The concept, it's in some sort of point of view obvious, but let me just kind of make the I'll expand on it. I'll expand my own personal version of it. So the basic idea is that in a space of conflict between competing agencies, the field of conflict is an determinant, meaning that it is everywhere and it is always looking for the location that is the place where it should be. So to be concrete, perhaps we're engaging in economic warfare at the moment, but perhaps we're going to shift that into cyber warfare. Maybe we'll move it into propaganda. Maybe we'll actually be engaging in intellectual property movement, whatever the field of conflict happens to be. And the point is that it's like two hands touching each other. Like the agents are always perfectly enveloping each other, right? They're wrapped around each other, an increasingly intimate embrace. And the idea of systems warfare, and by the way, I'm going to pop through this in a second, is if you're conscious of that and you're aware of it, then what you're doing is you're constantly probing any particular field. Right? This is not a kinetic theory. Right? Kinetic warfare is one tiny aspect of this much larger manifold. You're perturbating the entire field of the dynamic relationship and looking for locations where war making can take place, where destabilization of your competitive agent's agency, its sense making, its choice making, its resource allocation, its energy flows can take place across any one of those fields. And by the way, you move where that movement is relatively straightforward, relatively available, relatively easy. And when hardening occurs, you shift your exploration somewhere else, where you're constantly moving around that field. And so that's the basic theory. It's obviously the optimal theory if you have the intelligence to be able to move across that field with subtlety and nuance. And of course, intelligence is the thing that we're beginning to expand into leaps and bounds right now. And so a fully automated war machine will engage in that kind of n-dimensional, exploit-oriented perturbation and modulation evolution dynamic. So FYI, that's what it will look like for sure. And there is a kind of agency, this is again, of game B is orders of magnitude superior.
Yeah.
The design is that it's the kind of thing that does that kind of thing intrinsically better than anything else. It is.
And I think, exactly.
Form.
And I think this is where it gets super interesting because, I would say our economic relationships have been structured on theories of free trade and trade. Yet, when the war machine expands its fields of war to all the dimensions that you're talking about, takes the systems view of war, information, food systems, nutrient systems, energy systems, material systems, the theory of free trade or market-based trade becomes subservient to security. So what we're seeing is a kind of a shift, and I think the geopolitical shift we're right now seeing is trade is becoming subservient to geopolitics. And actually what's, even in the UK-US relationship, we've seen a move to the Atlantic Council, which has expanded the theory of security and engulfed the economic landscape. So UK AI is being treated as the same as US AI, as a critical technology. So we're now seeing the expansion of the fields of war and the sublimation and the kind of consumption of what are traditionally trade agreements into security agreements. And that, I think, is a really interesting metamorphosis. And I would argue that's happened in a moment where the UK government has perhaps not been the smartest government in the world. Yet those moves have happened, even with it not being, say, the kind of brightest government in the world, which means that they have been hitting the zeitgeist in certain aspects. And the same deal has happened with Japan, same deal has happened. So there's something going on, and this systems warfare is transforming our theory of trade and orchestration of resources into a different field. And that, I think, becomes super interesting. And I don't think we can yet reconcile our two conversations here, the kind of entanglement. And I think the entanglement maybe is also a key function, that everything becomes either care or war. And we oscillate between those things as behaviors, and that's interesting in its own right.
That's very interesting. Well, that's a very nice thing for us to talk about next time. That's fascinating.
Absolutely. Shall we do a little wrap there? That will give us a... Is that all right, Jordan? Great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to put this on pause and we'll catch up next time.